This is the hot topic that everyone is talking about.
Mm,
This is the major point of friction and controversy in the field. We have seen that psychedelic medicine with good support leads to benefits across symptom classes, across depression, anxiety, substance use disorder. Even in healthy normals, people feel better. The question is why? And there's really three different levels of analysis, and I think that there are different domains. So there's a strictly neurobiological set of explanations as to if something happens in the brain and that leads to benefit. I think there's a class of psychological mechanisms that psychotherapy is sort of with psychedelics is kind of on steroids. It's like rocket fuel for change processes, and there are specific psychedelic treatment things that happen that might lead to clinical benefit. And third, there's the idea of existential and spiritual and religious and the word mystical experience, which people have profound experiences even beyond the realms of their eschatology, their worldview, and that this leads to what have been called mystical type experiences, and that statistically seems to predict to some extent symptom benefit. And I'd like to go through each of these just for a few minutes. I mean, we could spend an hour on any of them, but in the basic sort of neurobiology sort of camp, there is some strong evidence that look, serotonergic hallucinogens like psilocybin are active at the 5-HT2A receptor sites. The serotonergic system, this molecule itself is very much like serotonin. It's not surprising that this affects people's mood and conception of self. Uh, it also, promotes BDNF, so there's a neuroplasticity hypothesis. Psychedelics open a critical learning window, and that within that window, combined with intentions to change and goal setting and support, people can make changes. For example, stopping depressive rumination and favoring a more self-compassionate way of thinking about oneself, which helps with depression and anxiety. There's also functional neuroconnectivity. You put people in a brain scanner, and suddenly all the different physiological reasons of regions of the brain are actually connecting in ways that they don't normally connect. We see this with people having synesthesia experiences. I interview folks, and in our studies at NYU, there's no cloud in the room, but they see a cloud in their vision, and they feel the wet vapor of it on their arm. They listen to the music and they see visions synesthetically. So the different areas of the brain are talking to each other in new ways. And we know that areas that fire together, wire together. It potentially promotes new, and as we've also seen, potentially new synaptogenesis, new connections and neurogenesis, even new neuronal growth. Most of these theories are in their early days. I mean, one of the favorites is the idea of the default mode network, the DMN, and Robin Carhart Harris and others have pursued this, which is it's basically what happens when you put people in a scanner, and usually people give them, the researchers give the patient puzzle tasks, but they noticed that when they stopped giving them puzzle tasks and just left them alone, this functional brain network came online, the default mode network, and this is where people were daydreaming, having experiences of reverie. They weren't giving anything to do, so they just had a sense of self. And so this has been equated to the ego. And with psilocybin and other psychedelics, the DMN sort of goes offline. And so the rigid boundaries of selfhood begin to ego lyse or melt down. And all of these are potentially compelling, but I don't think that they explain the full story. So in the second camp, we have psychological mechanisms, and this is not just a medical intervention. This is a combination treatment of medicine with preparation, support in the actual medicine session, and integration afterwards. The FDA is requiring currently 2 people to be in the room. And so it's a really intensive combination psychotherapy. And in psychotherapy, we know that the data suggests that psychotherapy alone is really efficacious. When you combine it with psychedelics, it probably takes the common factors of psychotherapy, things like therapeutic alliance, changed narrative and storytelling of your own experience, a different sense of self, ability to change cognitive and affective patterning. All of this happens in regular psychotherapy. It seems to happen in an accelerated way with psychedelics. And we know from my research and others that people also have really strong psychological experiences of catharsis. They say they feel every feeling they've ever felt, and oftentimes are feeling feelings that are scary, like fear or sadness or grief, that might be so overwhelming or so intolerable that they don't normally allow themselves to feel it. But with psychedelic medicine, with that support, it's such a a deep holding container, sometimes people are able to move through something that has kept them stuck.
Hmm.
And then lastly, this third idea, people are having mystical experiences, which we measure on something called the MEQ, but I don't think that's the be all end all. There's a lot of different profound experiences that people have of experiencing the real, experiencing profound positive unitary experiences, a sense of sacredness, a sense of ineffability, a transcendence of time and space, um, which are sort of what's being measured by the mystical experience questionnaire. But there's also, as we see in ayahuasca work and other work, people have nature experiences, people have encounters with entities, gods, deities, their highest self, parts of themselves they haven't normally accessed, their ancestors. I've done work in NYU where we're working with people who are New Yorkers on First Avenue in Bellevue Hospital who aren't out in the jungle, and they're having visions of their deceased relatives, grandparents appearing to them, visions of animals and other sort of serpents and two-headed cows and all sorts of incredible things that you wouldn't normally expect people in a Manhattan clinic to be, sort of experiencing. And so there's an archetypal or potentially a variety of relational and embodied spiritual experiences that people oftentimes are elicited in the psychedelic medicine work. And if we can help people make sense of what happened for them, that seems to be pointing the way towards changes in their life and potentially explains why they're less depressed, they're less anxious, they're less panicky, they don't feel the need to drink as much. The jury is still out. I think that psychedelic medicine breaks previous frames of understanding benefit, mechanisms of action, MOAs as they're sometimes called. It's probably not going to be a strict neurobiological, nor is it going to be a strict spiritual. I think it's going to be open to multiple pathways, and individuals will make sense of that. And I think researchers will make sense of that in different ways. It's a major tension in the field right now, which is how much preparation and support afterward, integration in these trials is needed for both safety, but also for helping people sustain benefit. Look, if psychedelics alone, I mean, this is in jest a little bit, if psychedelics alone cured depression and anxiety and trauma, everyone who went to a Grateful Dead concert would be well-adjusted and non-depressed and non-anxious. But we just know that that's not the case. There are spontaneous clinical benefit to many people in underground and naturalistic settings. But in all of the clinical trials that have been run so far, basically at this, except for a couple of outliers, there's a lot of thought that goes into the psychological and psychedelic support before and after. So people are meeting with usually two facilitators or therapists. They oftentimes have 2, 3, or 4 preparatory sessions beforehand to establish basic rapport, safety, and trust. And there's some really good research that shows that that therapeutic alliance actually drives depression benefit. And without the therapeutic alliance, without a feeling of safety, you may not get the best. You can't just drop people in and expect them to benefit without forming a bond of trust, human trust with the people that they're working with. And then integration has been the watchword. Both in clinical trials and in the community, people have these experiences. How do you make sense of it? So the first thing with integration is, and this is in sessions after the medication session, is to, as a therapist, I ask people, tell me what happened for you. Because oftentimes, they might be having an experience for hours, they might have eye shades on, they're listening to music. And it's important for them to journal about that, to narrate that experience to me, to tell the story about what happened. And in telling the story, we then start to move towards meaning making and sense making. So what does this mean to you? What was the significance of this vision or this experience or this physical experience that you had in your life story? And so we work with intentions that we set beforehand and goals afterward to translate altered states of consciousness into altered traits of living. And so this is a challenge, and there's different ways of doing this. We recently published a study looking at 17 different models that have been published in the peer-reviewed literature so far. And my colleague, Dr. Bill Brennan and I published this in Frontiers in Psychology, and it really reviews some of these basic support models through more comprehensive models that bring in techniques from cognitive behavioral therapy, that bring in techniques from motivational interviewing, that bring in conventional sort of historical psychedelic approaches, for example, like inner-directed healing or non-directive work, the idea that people have an inner healing intelligence. So there's different theories that guide the therapy frame. And I think the jury's still out as to which one might be best. There's a movement towards next generation psychedelic therapy, right? We're still sort of in the adolescence, but in a next generation model, how do we take these 17 theories and theoretically and using data meaningfully try to determine what's most useful for people and potentially for different people with different needs? And one of the theories that we're working on is Embark, which is a transdrug, transdiagnostic model that looks at all of these teachings from senior teachers in the field and tries to put together a theoretically coherent story as to how we should work with people, how best we should work with people. And just to go back to your question, in these clinical trials, most of the randomization is between people who get medicine and people who get placebo, right? They're not usually trials that compare people who get medicine and psychotherapy to people who just get medicine and no psychotherapy. There's not a lot of money in studying that, and the regulators aren't requiring that. So the question as to what's the added benefit of the psychotherapy, which psychotherapy is best for which condition and which population, is unfunded research that I think will be untangling for probably much of the rest of our lives. And it's exciting because it's not clear to us what's the best path forward all the time. So we're working with clinical wisdom and our experience, but not necessarily all the data we need to make the best choices. As you know, we're talking about a psychedelic resurgence or a renaissance, and there are studies from the 1960s, Eric Cast at the University of Chicago, where they did just that. They put people into a hospital room, a bare hospital room, without really even necessarily giving them psychoeducation to what they might expect, without giving them preparation, and just sort of said, go and do your thing. And there's a number of studies when you look at them that the no therapy model, this is from decades ago, but they oftentimes had no clinical benefit. Some of these studies did have some benefit, and the norm in the field was we need to integrate this. It's got to be the medicine with the therapy, with supportive therapy in preparation and integration afterward. Most recently, D'Souza at Yale has done a minimalist psychotherapy model. It's just a basic safety protocol where they gave DMT to people in the clinic, but with just a bare hospital room, no rug, no beautiful wall hangings, no plants necessarily, just like a basic bare bones model, and without preparatory psychotherapy and without integration, just a basic safety model. And they did actually see short-term benefit in depression. The benefit was much less than we see in any of the other psychedelic depression studies, and so I think the jury's still out on what the benefit might be or what the risk may be from not just people getting better or not getting better enough, but also risk potentially for adverse and serious adverse events like suicidal behavior, self-harm, other sorts of problems that people might have.